morning, Professor Spooner. How are you today?
Good morning, Frank. I'm well, thanks, and I hope you are too.
Thank you.
This has been an interesting week. There's so much going on, and it's difficult to decide what to focus on. But I was interested to see that for the first time, so far as I know, a new university is being established in England that will have a completely different curriculum from the typical university. And we may have spoken about this to some extent before, but we've never had an example of somebody trying to do something about it. And I particularly wanted to try to find out more about this. And I tried to find something on the internet about it, but every time I tried to get information on this, I got lists of places where I could find information, but I never actually got the information.
Mm-hmm.
Then another thing that's been happening is that the BBC has had a series of programs on the way our bodies are changing as a result of a social change under globalization. And they've been focusing on feet this week, and I thought that particularly interesting because in the same way that psychiatry has become a very popular medical profession because of the way people's social relationships are changing, even though psychiatrists are not, are MDs, not social scientists, we don't pay much attention to the ways globalization is changing us as human beings. And when I tried to find information about this too, I got just lists of places to find information, and I tried one of those and I got more lists and I couldn't find the information. So what's happening is that the information, there's so much information available about anything we want to talk about these days that and it's not organized in a way that everybody would be able to access it efficiently, that is becoming impossible. Anyway, I think probably I would like today to focus on the curriculum problem, since that's going to affect the way we think about everything in the future. And I'm interested in particular in the fact that the first place to try to do something about changing the curriculum, as far as I'm aware, is in England. And it's interesting that this sort of innovation tends to happen in England first, and I have no explanation for that. And whether it'll be the same after Brexit, I don't know. There's been a lot of discussion, or continuing discussion, about what's going to happen to after Brexit, especially since we're expecting to have a new prime minister who may be a Pakistani.
This is quite possible. Yes.
Anyway, when I think just simply of the way that the curriculum that I grew up with in the up until, well, I got my PhD in 1967, so it was in the period from the early 40s through to the late 60s that I was going through the curriculum from the beginning of primary school to the end as a graduate student. And a lot of things that were in the curriculum then have been got less and less attention since then, but the actual shape of the curriculum hasn't changed. And because when I came to America, I found that it was called liberal arts, and it took me a long time to understand what liberal arts were. But the idea of liberal arts is that you're being trained to be a useful citizen, I think, and presumably it's being a useful citizen in the 21st century is very difficult from being very different from being a useful citizen in the 19th century. But nobody seems to pay any attention to that, and the deans that I'm aware of, in particular, in the universities that I deal with, especially the University of Pennsylvania, don't really want to talk about it. So one wonders. And what I think is the main problem with it is that we're no longer being trained, simply that since the old curriculum isn't working as well as it used to, we're no longer being trained to use our language efficiently. And so you may have noticed that nobody knows the difference between you and I and you and me anymore.
Yes, I have noticed.
And there's a lot of things like that.
Yes.
Grammar has disappeared.
It has.
As a category of efficient expression.
So, what is the new curriculum of this university?
Yeah, obviously, the curriculum doesn't include anything about the modern world.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been getting larger and larger numbers of students in my courses. I have 150 in one and 200 in another, because I've started organizing courses that deal with how we can use what we've learned in the past to prepare ourselves for what we expect in the future. And this seems to interest students. But of course, there's very few courses on the curriculum that do that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
The courses are mainly to bring us up to date simply on what we've learned in the past.
So what do you know of the new curriculum at the university that just started in England?
Unfortunately, because of the inefficiency of Google and Yahoo and other search engines, I was unable to find that out this morning.
Okay.
And I suspect that it wouldn't solve all the problems that I can foresee. But for example, whereas we certainly need to continue to be able to use our language efficiently as it changes, so that language continues to be an efficient mode of expression. In the past, that was always done through writing, but now writing has become very different because so much of what is written for very different purposes and is done on a keyboard, not with a pen or even a typewriter.
Right.
And nobody learns how the keyboard works. Whereas it's true that for up until the 19th century, from roughly 3000 BCE until the 19th century, it was only specialists who knew how to write. And in the middle of the 19th century, it became a major factor in public education. The programming is a specialization now, and the same thing needs to be done to programming as was done to writing in the 19th century. It needs to be something that everybody learns about in the curriculum.
Well, language obviously has changed and continues to change since people began to use it thousands and thousands of years ago. And it will continue to evolve, I suspect, correct? So people either, it's almost like gearing it to the slowest horse in the race. If people are communicating and the language of expression is programming, for example, or much more socially media oriented as compared to people writing treatises on subjects that only other academicians read. Where is the growth in language? Is the growth in language at the former end, or is the former end just simply a one-off kind of flash in the pan, while the main growth is remaining with those who are using the traditional tools? I would think over history, it's been more. I mean, is there a consistency in language that remains? If Samuel Johnson was looking at what's being written now, would he find it all very familiar, or would he roll over in his grave?
The problem is that until the 1960s, everywhere in the Western world, grammar was based on Latin.
Mm-hmm.
And if you learned Latin, you learned the underlying grammatical structure of your own language, whether it was English or one of the other European Western languages. And it's only since the first half of the 60s that Latin has ceased to become a subject that everybody takes.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as I know, there's no course any longer in English grammar.
I think you're correct. Yeah.
Even though in the University of Pennsylvania, for example, you have to do a course in writing, but you're not told how to write.
Well, let me ask you the $64,000 question then. I mean, since language is used to communicate, and we're discussing if I may, the potential inadequacies of language now, is it failing as a tool to communicate? Are we becoming less clear with each other? Is there more confusion and more misunderstanding in society as a whole? I would have to say that the answer to that is a resounding yes.
Well, and I think that language is becoming a less efficient mode of expression.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We're becoming we're not so good at using it as we used to. And the point is that the curriculum of our education systems needs to keep up with social change. But of course, nobody studies social change. And in the past, even though there's never been a period of history without social change, it used to be relatively slow.
Right, right.
And over the last 100 years or so, it's been speeding up, and it's continuing to speed up. And so the curriculum is being left behind. And I think this is going to get us into a particularly difficult situation. It means that anything that you want to know, and one can see this beginning to happen already, one has to go to a particular specialist. And sometimes it's very difficult to find the right specialist or know which specialist you should go to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Whereas so many of these things there should be an introduction to them. I know that it would only be an introduction, but it would be a very valuable introduction in the curriculum. Yeah. Another thing is, of course, we know much more about human health now than we used to, but that's not in the curriculum. We know much more about, what else can we say?
Not much more about science, for example.
We know much more about how we got to where we are now, anyway.
Yeah.
And
the inadequacies of language they're not limited to English either. I mean, it's across the board. And why is that? Is that, do you think, because of social media and the way people are communicating now?
Everything that has to do with the use of language is changing.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of talking in small communities and writing letters that get put in the mail, we're now interacting through Facebook and Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
With people who don't use the language in the same way we do.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, if you're an optimist, then you simply see this as a way, something that expands our awareness, raises our level of awareness. But unfortunately, the medium isn't designed to do that.
No, and I think it leads to potential misunderstandings and confusion.
Yeah.
Right, because one of the reasons I suspect language was invented in the first place was so that people could accurately communicate their feelings and desires with each other. And
absolutely,
even if it's becoming less efficient, then that leads to greater frustration and leads to the potential for miscalculation. And when we have a president, for example, today who communicates through Twitter, who has a finger on a nuclear button, the potential for miscalculation and error is exponential. It's very different than what it could be.
Well, I mean, the current situation between the United States and Iran is difficult to understand because
That's an understatement.
everybody talks about war breaking out, but both sides say they don't want war, and it's very difficult to see any reason why there should be war,
Right.
because most of the things that uh,
Most of the things that
Iran
have,
is accused
most of the things that
of,
have been cited as the reasons for war have been in the news for years.
yeah,
And
yeah.
that goes to the lack of clarity, which I mean, I suppose some of this could be ascribed to that, but I think a lot of it has to do with other things. But nevertheless, it's a potentially very dangerous situation.
Yeah, so it's interesting to be able to argue that the way to solve all these problems actually lies in the university and has to do with redesigning the curriculum. But of course, even if the curriculum was redesigned, it would take a long time for it to have effect.
It would, but you
And
have to start somewhere.
what we need is not a redesign for the next century. What we need is a reorganization of academia to put it into the situation where there would be continuous redesign as things change.
Well, on that note, we'll have to dig a little deeper and wade through the search engines and find out more about this new curriculum for next week's session. So, all right. Well, thank you
Okay.
very much, Professor Spooner.
Okay.
All
I'll
right.
see you
Bye.
next week.
Bye.